First of all, I want to thank my colleagues and friends at AAR for inviting me to not only participate in this very important discussion, but also to be a part of it. I'm really thrilled and excited to be here. I think that this effort is kind of long overdue in the U.S. to try to really figure out what the skills and competencies are across the labor market. We've done a fair amount of work within certain industries, but not sort of as broadly as the PIAAC allows for us to do. So I think it's a very important initiative across the board. Anyway, I've been asked to share some of my reflections about the papers that were delivered yesterday. And I need to say it was quite a challenging task because it was a very sort of wide-ranging discussion, as you all know, that raised some very, very significant and important and complicated issues that I think many of us have been struggling with for many, many years. So for me, it raised a lot more questions than answers, but what I thought I would do is kind of share sort of what I take away from yesterday's discussions and from my readings of the papers. And I sort of organized my thoughts in 4 different buckets, kind of what I know that was validated by these studies, how these studies challenged me to think differently or more deeply about these issues, what do I want to know more about, what are my questions that I'm taking away, and what should or can we do about these issues raised by these papers, and about some of the trends that they point to more broadly. So first of all, I think many of us shared yesterday with each other that we know a lot of what these papers have shared with us. So it's like a sense of validation. So for example, the Hauser and Lehrman's study of the skills proficiency and labor market outcomes confirmed for us that social economic status is highly correlated with cognitive skills. That several studies also showed us that there were labor market returns to increased levels of skills, but some of the education and skills, or that the specific levels of education and skills that people possessed actually mattered, and some mattered more than others. So, for example, the 2 studies on immigration showed us that foreign earned credentials are undervalued both in the U.S. and in Canada. Lindemann's study on gender and numeracy skills found gendered patterns in the use of numeracy skills, and quite frankly in the recognition and value in the labor market as well. So some numeracy skills are recognized as such depending upon the jobs and the people that perform those jobs. It mattered for whether or not those skills were actually acknowledged as such. And Hauser and Lehrman again shows us that some people with some college and some post-secondary education actually have lower level of proficiencies than people with high school degrees. And that tells us that what Evelyn told us yesterday, or shared with us yesterday, in that there's a lot of discrepancy across the levels of education. In other words, there's lots of discrepancies within levels. And so a BA is not, a bachelor's degree is not a bachelor's degree is not a bachelor's degree. We can't sort of compare them across because there's different contents and they achieve different levels, or people achieve different levels depending upon the degree and perhaps even where the degree has been earned. So we also see persistent cycles of education and economic disadvantage. Those who need adult education and training the most are the least likely to get it. And I think several studies have showed us that, namely the participation studies, the Cummins and Kirkle and Walker and the Patterson and Paulson studies show that very clearly in their work. So that's kind of what I take away in terms of what was validated for me in these studies. And I know from some of my conversations with folks yesterday, a lot of you shared that sense of validation when it came to some of those findings. So what challenged me to think anew or to think more deeply about some of these issues that we think we know a lot about? I think the whole issue of the education proxy and how that's utilized or how education signals or sends signals, or level of education sends signals in the labor market. I think we all know something about that, but I think these studies allow for us to understand that dynamic and its consequences on a sort of a deeper level. So for example, papers showed the strong and persistent hold that the education proxy has on the American labor market. Degrees signal labor market exchange, or they are the signal upon which the labor market exchanges occur. Even though we see differences in skill levels and performance within the same level of education, the degree still matters, and it's becoming, I think, even a stronger marker or signal in the labor market. We have to question why that, even though we know that there's different levels of performance within the context of these degrees, why employers persist with this strategy. Capelli suggests that it's because it helps employers to socialize some of the costs and risks associated with investing in the skilled workforce. It kind of pushes that responsibility out to the educational enterprise and to individuals. So they don't have any onboarding costs, no training costs, and it solves their free rider problem. So if I train them, they'll leave and they'll take my investment elsewhere. Yet ironically, employers are not satisfied with the outcomes of this strategy. We continue to hear complaints about skills mismatching, skills shortages, yet we also don't see and at the same time it's very confusing because we also see evidence in these studies about the underutilization of the skills and the education that people bring to the workplace. So it's a very confusing dynamic, right? So there's lots of different contradictions that one can point to, and I think that leads to many of the squabbles that Evelyn talked about yesterday. It depends upon what part of the problem you're looking at and what data you're bringing to the conversation or to your argument. So it's a very complicated situation. And so there's huge debates about whether or not these skill shortages even exist. And that's probably yet another conversation that we could have. But the question, and I think Louis Soares raised it yesterday, is can a fine-grained or a more fine-grained analysis of skills that we see in the PIAAC studies, for example, and in some of the competency systems that are being developed throughout the economy, can these more fine-grained analyses get us, help us out of this quagmire, right? Is it an alternative approach? Does it help solve some of these questions and problems? What if we knew more about skills and how they were distributed across the labor market, how workers really used them in the workplace, what levels and skills actually mattered for occupations and for types of work? And suppose we develop better assessments and forms of documentations. What would be the implications of that? Having worked in trying to build many of these systems for many years in different industries and across industries, and inside workplaces, we used to call them career ladder projects. I can tell you that there's much more involved with this project than just codifying skills and identifying proficiencies and developing new contextualized delivery pedagogies and structures and assessments. First, Evelyn reminded us yesterday that there's been a tremendous proliferation of these systems across the American labor market. And it's very confusing. So that we don't even really know what some of these systems, some of these credentials represent because there's so many of them. And there's so many different types of them. There's certifications, there's licenses, there's degrees, there's other forms of credentials, and we haven't really even established a common nomenclature about what those degrees, what those different credentials mean, let alone what they contain, what they represent. So we have to figure out how to rationalize them, and that's difficult, number one. Number two, in my opinion, there's a significant and strong institutional path dependency in industry and across our labor market on the educational proxy. So in other words, we have built our entire labor market institutions and systems around it. And so therefore, what we're really talking about is systemic change. Not only within all of our labor market institutions, our education, our workplace, our industry, and including our labor law. I mean, if we want to ask an employer to move to a competency-based hiring system, well, they better, and use high-stakes credentials to actually facilitate that system, then they better do the hard work that it takes to ensure that the skills that they require match the jobs that they're hiring for. Otherwise, they set themselves up for enormous EEOC liabilities. And so we're really asking for them to take on a lot of risk in moving in this direction. And they haven't really been convinced that it's going to help them solve the problems that they think that they experience in the labor market. That's just one. I mean, if you go into higher education, that's yet another quagmire in terms of what does competency-based system mean for higher ed. And so we're asking these institutions that make up our labor market to make significant change. And that's hard. So it is a good idea. We all know that it's probably going to be beneficial. Probably get to that equity gap in some way. But moving the bar on this is very, very hard. Skills transparency have broad implications across a variety of institutions, and it bumps up against a lot of different sacred cows and hard and fast systems that we know people feel comfortable in working in. So it's no wonder that employers are reluctant to engage at the level at which we all know they need to. Because building these systems takes time, it takes money, it requires significant political capital and change, and it raises risks and liabilities that we can't ensure that will be minimized when we get to the other end. So the other area that I think that the other set of issues that I think were raised for me that challenges some of the things I think about or asks me to think more deeply are skills and learning, related to skills and learning. Number one, skills and learning are dynamic, social, and historic constructs. Yes, we can measure them in some degree, but we also have to remember that there's a lot of what we heard were the unobservable that goes on in the development of skills and in learning that can never be codified in a measurement system. And we also hear from Lindemann that we only recognize them as such when we've assigned value to them in the first place. So that there's a whole historic process that goes into identifying what skills are in the first place and how we value them. And so I think that needs to be taken into consideration when we think about skills, sort of this basic concept that we're all trying to get our hands around. The study conducted by Smith, Rose, Ross, Gordman, and Smith on readiness to learn, for example, expand our understanding of the importance of non-cognitive skills and dispositions developed outside of formal education, and argue the need to recognize the source and value of these skills. But they also found it very difficult to determine what sets of skills or disposition actually go into this construct of readiness to learn. What actually prepares someone? What actually readies them to learn? They found it difficult to figure that out and to answer that question. Perhaps it's because the characteristics and behaviors that lead one to be ready to learn vary across very diverse contexts and are rooted in people's personal life histories and learning ecologies. And that's hard to measure. So yes, we can measure and analyze the cause and effects of associations related to what we think are skills and the context within which they're developed and applied. And this is important to do. But these measures can only tell us part of the story. And my fear is that if we put too much emphasis on the measurable skills used to achieve literacy, technological and occupational proficiency, that we reduce our understanding of learning and skills to what we can measure. So how can we open up this discussion and our research to include insights into the non-cognitive skills, the role of personal experience, and people's learning ecologies and learning systems in the individual learning, and the importance of context or fit, as Billett calls it, or the press of learning in the workplace, and how that matters for what shows up at skills and how people learn them and how they're utilized. We also learned, as far as skills and learning is concerned, that context matters, right? New concepts and insights were introduced in these papers, at least to me. They were new to me. that brought this to light for me, and the concepts we saw in Pina's unobservables. The institutional and social factors and dynamics that affect whether or not individual learning and skills development can be leveraged into broader levels of social equity. How can we gain more insight into these factors and understand how they operate to distribute the resources and opportunities that result in a more equitable society? That's a big area of confusion, but I think it's also an area that, for me, sort of sparks a bigger interest. We've also seen some of these dynamics in the Smith and Fernandez study about how the different immigration policies actually affected the use and distribution of skills among immigrants, and also the levels of sort of equity that resulted from that mix. So I think that this institutional analysis, along with the skills analysis, is a very interesting and productive area to pursue. Another concept that we learned about was digital embeddedness. Again, I think it refers to the dynamic natures of digital skills, how their development and use are not straightforward, but they're embedded in a broader ecology that is created through the dynamic interaction of a number of social factors, many of which we really don't quite understand. But again, maybe if we did understand them better, we might also have a more robust understanding of what skills and learning really are. We also saw in many of these papers the developmental effects of people's personal situations and circumstances. The role of families, for example, parents, significant others, children, in whether or not people even engage in learning, or formal learning, or informal learning, or non-formal learning. The Patterson and Paulson study, the Barfalova and Fick study showed this, that these significant relationships mattered for whether or not people engaged in developmental and adult and educational activities. The power of context or press for learning was seen in the Patterson and Paulson study, for example. People who reported that they were in jobs that they thought required a more advanced level of education than they brought to it were more likely to engage in formal education than the individuals who thought that they had the educational levels that were sufficient for their jobs. So the press of the job, the context of the job, was directly linked to people's propensity to engage in advanced education. This reminds me that skills and learning capacities and strategies are not disembodied features of human capital. Rather, they are uniquely individual habits that enable people to relate to and know their world. In this light, relationships matter a great deal for one's sense of self and their identity as a learner. And this identity also matters greatly for the development of the individual efficacy and motivation to engage in formal learning activities. We have to rethink who and what we consider to be the mentors of people who are engaging in learning. And the nature, we also need to think more deeply about the developmental relationships that are required to help people really engage in a higher level of learning. The third area that I'd like to mention about that the papers helped me think more broadly or deeply about was the differences between social equity and individual mobility. I think that sometimes as Americans we like to look at the individual phenomenon, and we forget that there's a broader set of dynamics and results that might not show up in individual patterns, right? So Pina again and Redner both offered broader frameworks to help us think more deeply about these differences between equity and individual opportunity. I mentioned those earlier, the unobservables, the embeddedness concepts. More education and training results in, we see that more education and training can result in individual mobility, but will it move the bar on the societal level and help more equalize the distribution of resources and opportunities across groups in society? That's the question here. How can we leverage this individual learning to achieve more equitable results on a societal level? So Robbie yesterday, our last discussions, asked us that if we come back here in 10 years from now and nothing has changed, will this all have mattered? She challenged us to move the bar on these broader dynamics that open up access to education and skill formation resources to people across society, and then make their achievements more consequential for them and their families and their communities. Tony asks, Tony Sarmiento, my colleague and brother from the labor movement, he asks, how can we make skill pay? Now I'm going to sound like I'm contradicting myself a little bit from when I talked about how difficult it is for employers to engage in these processes and make these institutional changes. Because I see no other way out of this challenge without the significant and sustained employer investment and authentic engagement in the development of use of skills of the U.S. workforce. So yes, it's hard. Yes, it's risky. But we will not move the bar without it. So that's the challenge, right? So if we look at the barriers to participation in learning that the studies identified, time, money, lack of perceived need to perform and keep current job, all of these can change. All these can be addressed by employer investment and engagement, and perhaps they can't be addressed significantly without it. If we look at what we know about how adults learn and about how they make how we make formal education more accessible to adults, it's through contextualized education. It's through and this means that employers must engage in the design of education, and they must figure out alternative ways of embedding learning in the work processes. Mentoring, shadowing, job aids and drills, assignment of progressively challenging tasks and responsibilities that require people to engage in ongoing learning. There's a good reason why the federal government today in the U.S. is reinvesting in the apprenticeship model. It's because we know it works, right? And all of these features are embedded in that model. So we can't do that. We can't re-engage the apprenticeship model and utilize it in a way that we can see gains from it without employer engagement and involvement. We also heard the discussion about the importance of the demand side and the structure of jobs and how those factors affect wages. Employers control these factors. And research shows that their decisions and choices about these factors matter greatly for whether or not skills are used, how they're distributed across the labor market, and how they're rewarded. So in addition, we know from our colleagues in the labor market literature, specifically Cochin, Feingold, Osterman, and others, they talk about Applebaum. They talk about the importance of work organization, and some of them talk about the importance of the middle skill jobs that today employ 48% of the entire U.S. workforce. And though we lack aggregate data about the shortages in these particular labor markets, and there's some debates about whether or not there is a shortage, the numbers of these jobs are expected to grow, and if we look at the PIAAC skills, we see that the vast majority of the American population, at least statistically, do not have these skills. We couple that with the retirement bubble in many of these jobs, and we know that there's a potential problem come the future. So we can take steps to prepare the K through 12 system and youth to develop stronger STEM skills, which are considered important in these jobs. But that also is a long-term strategy, and quite frankly, we haven't completely figured out that system yet either. So whether or not we can lay our bet on the long term, that's debatable. Meanwhile, the youth of today will be the adults of tomorrow, and they will need ongoing support for their education and training. So we better get busy on building a system that can serve the needs today and accommodate the needs that we know are going to be there in the future. We can't keep kicking this bucket down the road. We know too much about the consequences. And we also, quite frankly, know too much about how to go about fixing it. But we need sustained and significant and authentic employer engagement in this effort. So employers need to fill the gap. They talk about the skills gap. We can also start talking about the engagement gap, because I think they go hand in hand. So what's going to make the difference here? I certainly don't have the answers, but I know that an approach that doesn't include a very thoughtful strategy and an honest engagement with employers around what they need and what the risks are involved to them to engage in this, it's not going to result in the gains that we think we all need. My other question then is, what would I like to know more about? What are my remaining questions? So what other skills matter for who and for why? What is the role of non-cognitive skills? What are the role of these developmental relationships? Now, I know that PIAAC data can't answer all of that, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't also be looking at those types of questions. To what extent is the association between skill and economic outcomes observed in these studies related to the variation in the labor market and working conditions and not variation in workers' proficiency? For example, to what degree do jobs press adults to engage in the formal and informal learning that allow for them to develop and maintain higher cognitive skills? So we're seeing, the proficiencies, and we're seeing them as though that's what people bring. But what if it's that they develop them there in the first place? And so that would require, I think, a different level of understanding and a different engagement. I've got a couple other questions, but I've got 5 minutes, so I also want to move to the discussion about, kind of what could or should we do here. PIAAC points to the limits of policy, the policy goal of reducing wage inequity she points to the limitations of an individual skills development strategy, right? So she says individual opportunity is very important, and it's very important for individuals, but there's other institutional factors that contribute to wage inequity, and policies need to be addressing those as well. We have all kinds of suggestions in the paper regarding the ways to finance education, individual learning accounts, incumbent worker trainings, public funding for training, policies that promote shared responsibility across the labor market for the training, revisit post-secondary, Batalova and Fix encourage us to revisit the post-secondary recession reductions to the ABE and the ESL funding on the federal and state levels. There's been a 36% decline in participation in these systems, and we still know that those issues and those gaps and those needs need to be met. The other areas that I find promising that we've learned about lately is new sort of spirit and activity of interagency collaboration on the federal level across the various departments and agencies that receive workforce development money. There's money there in almost every agency, but it's not coordinated. So there's a new effort in the federal government to coordinate across these various agencies their use and the structure of this funding and the use in various regions and communities. And I see that as a policy level intervention that might move the bar a little bit here. We also talked at our table extensively yesterday, and I think about improvements to the U.S. labor market information system. And there's lots to say here about what we could do, but we need to invest in that system. We need to have more consistent data. We need to have more ability to link aggregate data to individual activities so that we can see patterns across subgroups in a more robust way. Lots of stuff on practice. New approaches to contextualize adult education and training hold a lot of promise. Looking at, I think the whole idea of looking at the stemming of work rather than STEM work. So what work requires STEM skills sort of opens up a better view of the kinds of STEM skills that people bring to work and how they can be leveraged to move people into higher level STEM jobs. And transferred in that way. There's lots of stuff around the transfer of learning that we see in these papers, and how to leverage learning. For example, in the Readiness to Learn paper, lots of discussion or some discussion around how to help people leverage their skills that they develop or use at home in the workplace, and some really good practice-related suggestions there. One thing that I've been sort of harping on lately is, again, to move the bar from a practice perspective. We know a lot about what works, And a lot of that knowledge and those expertise are not broadly distributed throughout our workforce and workforce development system. How can we build the capacities of people in that system to actually engage in these more innovative? How can we help them work more effectively with employers, for example? How can we help them take up some of these new and build new partnerships and take up some new competency frameworks and utilize the information about skills in new ways? I think there's just a tremendous amount of work that could go on in that area that would be helpful. And as far as the research is concerned, I have some things to say, but I think the biggest thing that I have found, especially related to the PIAAC, and we've talked about this amongst ourselves here, is the limitation of the data set. You know, we have to increase that in. We have to increase it across many subpopulations in order for us to begin to utilize it to make some significant analyses that we can really stand behind and defend. One final thing, I know I'm over time, but one final thing, thanks. I think these forums are great. You know, we talk a lot about in sort of in higher ed and in the academy about, you know, the research to practice divide, right? I mean, we do all this great work and nobody uses it, right? And then we hear from the practitioners, how do we, you know, how make this usable for me? You know, this is good stuff, but if I can't use it, it might as well sit on the shelf. So I think these forums go a long way in helping us think through that divide. And I think we could structure them in a way that moves the bar on that problem as well. You know, so can we bring together practitioners and researchers who are interested in specific issues and have the researchers hear from the practitioners about, well, what do you not know? That more information or more knowledge or deeper knowledge would help you have a better understanding and therefore allow for you to take more effective action. And so these partnerships, I think, are important. These forums are important, but I think I'd like to see them move to a more of a partnership, you know, research to practice, action, right? That's what we're here for. Okay, thank you very much.